A millionaire, arriving late for an important meeting, saw his mother who died 7 years ago. Without thinking, he came closer, but when she started talking he was horrified. Before starting the video, tell me where you are watching this video and what time it is. Mark Emerson had it all: wealth, prestige, and the admiration of the business world. Yet, as he sped through the rain-drenched streets of the city, gripping the leather steering wheel of his luxury sedan, his mind was far from his riches. He was late, painfully late, for a high-stakes meeting with investors who could secure his company's expansion into Europe. The rain came down in relentless sheets, blurring the cityscape outside. Horns blared as impatient drivers jostled for position on the congested streets. Mark's jaw tightened as he glanced at the clock on the dashboard. Each passing second felt like a nail in the coffin of his meticulously planned day. His route took him past Lincoln Park, an oasis of green now turned into a murky swamp under the storm. Normally he wouldn't spare it a second glance, but someone caught his eye. Under a gnarled oak tree, just visible through the rain, sat a figure. At first, he thought it was a homeless person seeking shelter, but there was something familiar about the posture, the silhouette, the calm stillness despite the downpour. Mark's foot eased off the gas. He squinted, leaning forward as if doing so would pierce the veil of rain. The figure wasn't shivering or seeking cover but sat upright, serene. A faded umbrella rested against their shoulder, doing little to shield them from the rain. "Unbelievable," he muttered, shaking his head. It was absurd to think he recognized this person. He was tired, stressed, and under pressure. But as the figure turned their head ever so slightly, a bolt of electricity shot through him. "No," he whispered, his voice trembling. The resemblance was uncanny. The face, partially obscured by the rain, bore the features of someone he thought he'd never see again. Someone he couldn't see again. It looked just like her, his mother. The same soft curls escaping the edges of her scarf, the same worn cardigan she used to wear when tending to her garden. Mark felt his pulse quicken. His hands gripped the steering wheel as if anchoring him to reality. But reality felt slippery, like the rain streaking down his windshield. Could it really be her? Mark's mind raced as he brought the car to a hesitant stop at the curb. The windshield wipers slashed furiously across the glass, but they couldn't clear the fog of disbelief clouding his thoughts. He stared at the figure under the tree, unable to look away. "It's not possible," he muttered to himself. His hands, usually steady from years of commanding boardrooms, trembled on the steering wheel. She wasn't just similar to his mother, she was identical. Her favorite floral scarf, the one she always said reminded her of spring, was draped around her shoulders. The faded umbrella she carried had once been a staple of their rainy day walks. Every detail was precise, as if time had frozen her image in his memory and now projected it onto this scene. The rain was deafening as it pummeled the roof of the car, but it couldn't drown out the pounding of his heart. He reached for his phone, instinctively thinking to call someone, anyone, to verify he wasn't losing his mind. But his fingers hovered over the screen, paralyzed by doubt. What could he say? That he thought he'd seen his mother 7 years after her funeral. His eyes darted back to the figure. She hadn't moved, as though she were waiting for him. Her gaze seemed fixed on the horizon, but Mark could feel an unspoken pull, an invisible thread drawing him closer. "I have to know," he whispered, abandoning the phone. He killed the engine, grabbed his coat, and stepped out into the storm. The cold rain was a shock to his senses, soaking through his tailored suit in seconds, but he didn't care. His shoes squelched in the muddy grass as he approached. Every step felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of his memories pressed against him. He recalled the hospital room, the sterile smell, and the heart monitor's relentless beeping as her life slipped away. He remembered the ache of losing her, the regret of missed calls and unspoken words. "Mom," he called out, his voice trembling as much as his body. The figure turned to him slowly, lifting her face toward his. The rain blurred her features at first, but as her eyes locked onto his, Mark's breath caught. It was her. It was undeniably her. Mark stood frozen, the rain soaking him to the bone as he stared at the figure before him. She smiled faintly, the kind of smile that had comforted him countless times as a child. Her lips parted, and when she spoke, her voice was exactly as he remembered. Gentle, warm, and unmistakably hers. "Mark," she said, her tone lilting with familiarity. "You look so tired, my boy." His heart slammed against his ribcage. It can't be you." He took a step back, his mind reeling. "You're gone. You've been gone for years." Her smile didn't waver. If anything, it deepened, but there was an undeniable sadness in her eyes. "I've missed you so much," she said softly, tilting her head as if studying him. "You've grown so far away from yourself." Mark's hands curled into fists, his nails digging into his palms. This wasn't real. Couldn't be real. But every detail, the texture of her voice, the lines around her eyes, the way she held her umbrella, was vivid. Memories of their last conversation flooded back to him, that ordinary phone call he had brushed off because of work. He had no idea it would be the last time he'd ever hear her voice. "Are you a ghost?" he asked hesitantly, his throat dry despite the rain. "Am I losing my mind?" She shook her head gently. "You're not losing your mind, Mark." Her tone grew more somber. "I'm here because there are things you need to know. Things you've ignored for too long." "What things?" he asked, his voice rising with frustration. The air around him felt thicker, as if the storm itself were tightening its grip. "What is this? Why are you here now?" Her expression shifted, the sadness deepening into something darker. Her gaze pierced through him, and her voice dropped to a near whisper. "There's danger all around you, Mark. Someone you trust has betrayed you. You're in more trouble than you know." His stomach churned. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice breaking. "Ooh. How do you know?" Before she could answer, her image began to flicker, like static on a broken TV. Her lips moved, forming words he couldn't hear. The wind picked up, howling through the trees. "Wait!" Mark shouted, reaching out toward her. "Don't go." Her final words cut through the storm like a blade. "You have to act before it's too late." And then she was gone. The rain continued to pour as Mark stumbled back to his car, his mind a whirlwind of memories. He couldn't erase the image of her face, the urgency in her voice, or the chilling weight of her final words. Her presence, so vivid and real, unearthed the pain he had buried deep within himself for years. Mark's mother, Margaret Emerson, had been the cornerstone of his life. She was a single mother who had raised him with unwavering love and determination. Their small home was humble but filled with warmth. Every morning, she would wake early to pack his lunch, leaving him little notes of encouragement. Every evening, she would sit by his side, helping him with homework, even after long shifts at the diner where she worked. Her laughter was his favorite sound, bright and unrestrained, filling every corner of the room. Even during their hardest times, she found a way to make life feel magical. When the electricity was cut off during a particularly rough winter, she turned the blackout into an adventure, building a fortress of blankets and telling him stories by candlelight. Mark remembered how she had cheered the loudest at his high school graduation, tears of pride streaming down her face. She'd worked overtime for months to buy him his first laptop when he earned a scholarship to study business. "You're going to do great things, Mark," she told him. "But don't forget, success means nothing if you're not happy." That memory stabbed at his heart now. Success, happiness. Somewhere along the way, he had lost sight of both. Margaret's death had been sudden and devastating. One moment she was vibrant, full of life. The next, a heart attack had stolen her away. Mark had been on a business trip at the time, unable to answer her last call. He learned of her passing from his assistant, the news hitting him like a freight train. He buried himself in work to escape the grief. He told himself it was what she would have wanted, for him to focus on his career and build a life she could be proud of. But now, he wondered if he had been running from something deeper. Mark sat in the driver's seat of his idling car, the rain beating a relentless rhythm against the roof. His soaked suit clung to his skin, but he barely noticed. His mind was consumed by the apparition in the park and the emotions it had dredged up, emotions he thought he had buried for good. Since his mother's death, Mark had transformed himself into the embodiment of professional success. The boy who grew up in a cramped apartment now lived in a sprawling penthouse overlooking the city. His name graced the covers of business magazines, and his company was valued at over $1 billion. He had everything he'd ever dreamed of, or so he told himself. Yet, in the quiet moments when the noise of the world faded, he felt the emptiness. His lavish lifestyle had come at a cost. He had drifted away from the people who truly mattered. His sister, Emily, had called him endlessly after their mother's passing, begging him to take time to grieve. "Mom wouldn't want you to drown yourself in work, Mark," she had said. But he had brushed her off, saying he was too busy and promising to catch up soon, a promise he never kept. Even his friendships had withered under the weight of his ambition. Birthdays, weddings, even simple coffee dates. He missed them all, always using work as an excuse. It wasn't personal, he told himself. He was building a legacy, creating something that would last. But in moments like this, he felt the truth gnawing at him. His success hadn't healed the pain of losing his mother. It had only built walls around it. He often dreamt of her, standing in their old kitchen, humming a tune as she stirred something on the stove. In those dreams, he could almost feel her presence, hear her voice, but he always woke with the ache of absence. And now she had appeared, not in a dream but in reality, or something that felt alarmingly like it. Her words replayed in his mind, her warning reverberating in his chest. "Someone you trust has betrayed you." Mark clenched the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white. If she had come back to tell him this, what did it mean? And why now? The rain outside Mark's car finally began to taper off, but the storm within him raged on. He sat motionless, his thoughts spiraling as he replayed every moment of the encounter in the park. Was he hallucinating? Was it the stress, the pressure of running a company, finally breaking him? Or was it something else entirely, something beyond reason? He had always prided himself on being a man of logic, someone who didn't entertain fantasies or superstitions. Yet his mother's appearance had been so vivid, her words so deliberate. She wasn't just a fleeting image or a shadow in the corner of his eye. She had spoken to him, warned him. But about what? Who could she mean when she said someone close to him had betrayed him? His mind flitted to his inner circle. Was it Charles, his longtime CFO and confidant? Or perhaps Amanda, his ambitious head of marketing? Even his sister, Emily, briefly crossed his thoughts, though he immediately dismissed the idea. Emily, though distant, would never hurt him. Her warning pulled at a deep, unresolved part of him. For years, he had buried his guilt over her death, telling himself that there was nothing he could have done. But now a new fear gripped him. What if her death hadn't been as natural as it seemed? Could her appearance be tied to some truth he had failed to uncover, or worse, ignored? The encounter forced him to confront more than just his mother's memory. It brought to the surface the hollowness that had pervaded his life for years. He had achieved wealth and power, but at what cost? The people he trusted most might not be as loyal as they seemed, and the foundations of his carefully built empire suddenly felt shaky. Rain droplets on the windshield began to catch the faint glimmer of sunlight breaking through the clouds. The world outside seemed to be moving forward, indifferent to his turmoil. But Mark felt trapped, as though time had splintered into 1,000 pieces, and he was left alone to pick them up. Whatever this was, hallucination, warning, or supernatural intervention, it had changed something in him. He couldn't go back to ignoring his instincts or his past. He had to find answers. The moment Mark stepped out of his car for the second time, a chill crept down his spine. Though the rain had slowed, the air was thick with a strange tension, as if the storm hadn't quite finished its business. He retraced his steps toward the tree where he had seen her, the ground beneath his feet soggy and uncertain. The park felt eerily still now. The hustle of city life seemed distant, muffled by the lingering mist and the soft patter of droplets falling from the leaves. His heart pounded as he drew closer to the spot where she had been. There was no sign of her now, not even the faint outline of her figure. Mark's mind swirled with questions. Was this where she had been sitting? Had he imagined her entirely? But as his eyes swept the ground, something caught his attention. A single item left behind, resting against the tree trunk. His breath caught. It was the umbrella. Worn but unmistakable, it leaned against the bark as if waiting for him to find it. He crouched down, hesitant, and reached out to touch it. The fabric was damp but intact, the same faded floral pattern he remembered from his childhood. He hadn't seen this umbrella in years. It had disappeared with her when she died. Mark. The voice behind him made him jump. He spun around, clutching the umbrella instinctively. And there she was, standing just a few feet away. She looked just as she had before. Calm, collected, and achingly familiar. But now, her expression was unreadable. Her eyes reflecting a depth that unnerved him. "You came back," she said softly, tilting her head. "I wasn't sure you would." "Mom," his voice cracked, the word hanging in the air. "Is it really you?" "It's me," she said simply, though her tone carried a weight that made his stomach twist. "You've been running from so much, Mark. But you can't run anymore." He took a tentative step closer, his grip on the umbrella tightening. "What are you talking about? How are you here? How is any of this happening?" She smiled faintly but didn't answer. Instead, she motioned for him to sit beside her on the damp grass, as if they were back in his childhood park, sharing secrets on lazy Sunday afternoons. "Sit," she said. "We need to talk." Mark hesitated, every instinct urging him to keep his distance. But the look in her eyes, a mix of warmth and urgency, compelled him forward. He sank onto the damp grass beside her, the cold seeping through his trousers. The umbrella rested across his lap like a relic of another life. His mother turned to him, her gaze piercing. "You've done well for yourself, Mark. I always knew you would." He swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. "But how are you here? This doesn't make sense." "You died, Mom. I was there, I saw." Her hand reached out and touched his, silencing him. It was solid, warm, and unmistakably real. "I know this is hard to understand," she said gently, "but I don't have much time. What matters now is that you listen." Mark's mind raced, every question colliding in his head. But he nodded, the raw intensity of her presence leaving no room for argument. She began to speak, her words measured. "There are things you never knew about my death, Mark. Things that were hidden from you." His stomach churned. "What do you mean? You had a heart attack." It was sudden. "The doctors." "It wasn't a heart attack," she interrupted, her voice firm but not unkind. "That's what they wanted you to believe. But I need you to understand the truth now, before it's too late." Mark's hands trembled as he gripped the umbrella tighter. "Who's they? What are you talking about?" Her expression darkened, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of fear in her eyes. "Someone close to you, Mark. Someone you trust. They know more about what happened to me than you realize. And now they're a danger to you." The world seemed to tilt beneath him. He shook his head, trying to make sense of her words. "You're saying someone killed you? That it wasn't natural?" She nodded solemnly, her hand tightening over his. "Yes. And unless you confront them, they'll destroy everything you've built, everything you care about." Mark's breath hitched. "Who is it? Tell me who." But instead of answering, her form seemed to waver, as if the air around her was bending. Her voice became a whisper, barely audible over the pounding of his heart. "Trust no one, Mark. Not until you uncover the truth." Mark surged to his feet, his pulse pounding in his ears. The world around him seemed to dim as her words sank in. Trust no one. It wasn't just a warning. It was a bomb detonating in the center of his carefully curated life. He looked back at her, but something about her had changed. Her face seemed etched with a profound sadness, her shoulders weighed down by the secrets she carried. He stepped closer, desperation lacing his voice. "You can't just leave me with that. Tell me who I can't trust. I need to know, Mom." Her gaze softened, and for a fleeting moment, she was simply his mother again, the woman who had once wiped away his tears, who had believed in him when no one else did. But when she spoke, her voice carried the gravity of something far beyond him. "There are things you've ignored for too long," she said. "The truth is all around you, Mark, but you haven't been looking. My death wasn't just a loss. It was part of something bigger. Something they've been hiding from you." Mark's fists clenched. "Ooh. What are they hiding? Why would anyone hurt you?" She didn't answer directly. Instead, she looked away, her gaze settling on the horizon as if searching for something, or someone. "You've built your life around people you thought you could trust. But you were wrong." His breath came in short, sharp bursts. Faces swam through his mind. Charles, Amanda, Emily. Each name came with memories of loyalty, shared victories, and unspoken bonds. But now those bonds felt fragile, tainted by the weight of her warning. "What did they do?" Mark demanded. "Tell me who they are and I'll—" "You'll find out," she said, cutting him off. Her tone was resolute. "But be careful. The truth will test you in ways you can't imagine." Before Mark could reply, the air around her shimmered again, her form flickering like a fading photograph. Panic gripped him. "Wait. Don't leave. I need you." Her final words reached him as her image dissolved into the mist. "Follow the clues, Mark. They've always been there. Start with my things. What they didn't want you to find." And then she was gone, leaving Mark standing alone in the storm's aftermath, clutching the umbrella like a lifeline. Mark stood rooted to the spot, the umbrella gripped tightly in his hand. His mother's parting words echoed in his mind like a haunting melody. "Start with my things." He had avoided her belongings after her death, unable to face the pain of her absence. But now they might hold the answers he needed. Hours later, he found himself in the attic of his penthouse, surrounded by boxes he hadn't opened in years. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light filtering through the single, small window. His hands trembled as he opened the first box, uncovering stacks of photographs, letters, and mementos from a life they had shared. First, nothing seemed unusual. Her gardening gloves, old recipe books, and a faded family portrait, all things that felt achingly familiar. But then, buried beneath a stack of notebooks, he found a small, locked box he didn't recognize. His heart quickened. The box was old, its metal tarnished with age, but its lock was intact. After searching for a key to no avail, Mark resorted to breaking it open. The lid creaked as he lifted it, revealing a collection of papers, photographs, and a worn leather journal. He flipped through the pages of the journal, his mother's neat handwriting filling each line. At first, it seemed to be a collection of everyday musings, recipes, shopping lists, reminders. But then the tone shifted. Her words became hurried, fragmented, laced with worry. "Something feels off about Charles. I don't know why, but I feel like he's hiding something from Mark. I can't ignore it anymore." Mark's chest tightened. Charles. His trusted CFO. The man who had been by his side since the company's inception. He read on, his mother's suspicions growing clearer. She mentioned inconsistencies in financial reports, unexplained late-night phone calls, and subtle shifts in his demeanor. At the bottom of the page, her last entry hit him like a freight train. "If something happens to me, it won't be an accident." His hands shook as he set the journal aside and pulled out the photographs from the box. One of them stopped him cold. It was of Charles, standing outside a diner, deep in conversation with a man Mark didn't recognize. Scrawled on the back were the words, "March 5th. They didn't see me." The realization hit him like a cold wind. His mother's death wasn't natural, and Charles might be the reason why. Mark sat back on his heels, the journal and photograph clutched in his hands. The room around him seemed to close in, the walls pressing tighter as the weight of the revelation bore down on him. He stared at the photograph, his mind racing through years of interactions with Charles. The man had been there from the start, guiding him through the challenges of building his empire. He was a mentor, a confidant, practically family. But now Mark wasn't sure who Charles really was. He flipped back to the journal's entry, reading the words over and over again. If something happens to me, it won't be an accident. The implications were staggering. His mother had suspected foul play, and she had linked it directly to Charles. Mark felt a wave of nausea. Could it be true? Could the man he trusted most have been involved in her death? The photograph provided no easy answers. The man with Charles in the picture was a stranger to Mark, but the intensity of their conversation suggested it wasn't casual. Mark's mind flooded with questions. Who was this man? What was Charles doing with him? And why hadn't Mark noticed anything suspicious at the time? The more he thought about it, the more the pieces began to align in ways that made his skin crawl. There were small moments, easily dismissed at the time, that now took on new meaning. Charles's reluctance to discuss his mother's death. The way he had insisted on handling the financial details of her estate. The vague explanations when discrepancies arose in company funds. Mark's breathing quickened. He felt betrayed, not just by Charles but by his own blindness. How could he have been so focused on his work, so consumed by his grief, that he hadn't seen what was happening right in front of him? He stood abruptly, the photograph and journal still in his grip. This wasn't the time for paralysis. His mother had left him this trail for a reason. She had given him the tools to uncover the truth, but now it was up to him to use them. Mark pulled out his phone and opened his contacts, his thumb hovering over Charles's name. The man had always been one call away. But now the thought of hearing his voice made Mark's blood boil. Mark paced the attic, his mind racing as he tried to form a plan. The photograph and journal entries had confirmed what he feared. His mother's death wasn't natural. But proving it, uncovering the full truth, and confronting those responsible, those were entirely different challenges. He stared at his phone, Charles's name glaring back at him. Calling him now without more evidence would be a mistake. Charles was too calculated, too shrewd to slip up with a mere accusation. Mark needed to be smart about this. His mother's warning echoed in his mind. Trust no one. Taking a deep breath, he tucked the photograph and journal into his briefcase, locking it securely. He couldn't leave these in the attic or anywhere else they could be found. If Charles or anyone else knew he was digging into his mother's death, he might lose the advantage. Mark's next move was clear. He needed information, details about the man in the photograph, connections between Charles and his mother's death, and any evidence that could tie them together. But he couldn't do it alone. For this, he needed help from someone outside his immediate circle, someone he could trust implicitly. His thoughts turned to an old friend, Liam Harper, a private investigator who had left the police force years ago to open his own agency. Liam wasn't the type to ask unnecessary questions, and more importantly, he owed Mark a favor. If anyone could uncover the truth, it was him. Grabbing his keys and coat, Mark made his way to the car. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the city cloaked in a damp, uneasy silence. As he drove to Liam's office, he replayed every interaction he'd had with Charles over the years, searching for clues he might have missed. By the time he arrived, his resolve had hardened. Liam greeted him with a skeptical smile, but Mark's grave expression quickly wiped it away. "I need your help," Mark said, pulling out the photograph and journal. "And I need it to stay between us." Liam raised an eyebrow, scanning the items before him. "This looks serious." "It is," Mark replied. His voice was steady, but the fire in his eyes betrayed his fury. "Someone killed my mother. I need you to help me prove it." Liam leaned back in his chair, his sharp eyes scanning the photograph and journal Mark had handed him. The dimly lit office, with its stacks of case files and a half-empty coffee mug, felt like the perfect backdrop for the weight of their conversation. Mark sat across from him, tense, his fists resting on his knees as he waited for Liam's verdict. "This is heavy," Liam said finally, flipping through the journal again. He tapped the photo. "This guy here, you have no idea who he is." Mark shook his head. "None. But Charles knew him. That much is clear." Liam nodded, his brow furrowing. "And you're telling me this woman, your mom, left you this trail from beyond the grave?" "It sounds insane, I know," Mark admitted, his voice thick with frustration. "But it's real. I saw her, Liam. She warned me about Charles and told me to look for answers in her things. This journal and photo are all I've found so far." Liam studied Mark for a moment, his skepticism tempered by the genuine desperation in his friend's eyes. "All right," he said, sitting up. "Here's how we play this. I'll run the man in the photo through my contacts and see if we can identify him. If this guy has any connection to Charles or your mother, we'll find it." Mark let out a slow breath, relief and tension battling within him. "Thank you," he said. "But I don't want this traced back to me. If Charles finds out I'm looking into him, it'll ruin everything." Liam smirked. "Your lucky discretion's my specialty. Just keep playing it cool on your end. Act normal like nothing's changed. Don't tip him off." Mark nodded, but the thought of pretending around Charles made his skin crawl. He didn't know how he could look the man in the eye again without confronting him. As Liam began making calls and running checks, Mark's mind raced. What if the photo led nowhere? What if Charles really was behind his mother's death but had covered his tracks too well? For the first time in years, Mark felt powerless, like the boy who had lost his mother all over again. But this time he wouldn't let grief stop him. This time he'd uncover the truth, no matter what it cost. The days that followed tested Mark's patience and resolve in ways he hadn't anticipated. While Liam worked behind the scenes to investigate the photo and journal, Mark returned to his daily life, putting on a facade of normalcy. Meetings, phone calls, and business deals filled his schedule, but beneath the surface, his focus was fractured. Every encounter with Charles felt like navigating a minefield. At first, Mark avoided Charles altogether, feigning a packed itinerary to dodge casual conversations or shared meals. But he quickly realized this behavior might raise suspicion. He forced himself to engage, exchanging pleasantries while searching for subtle signs of guilt. Was Charles hiding something? Or had Mark misinterpreted his mother's warnings? The uncertainty gnawed at him. In his quiet moments, Mark found himself revisiting the memories of his mother. Her words echoed in his mind, not just the warnings but the lessons she had imparted throughout his life. She had always emphasized the importance of integrity, of valuing people over profit, of being present for the ones you love. But he had drifted far from those principles in his relentless pursuit of success. That realization hit him hardest one evening when he stared out the window of his penthouse, the city lights stretching endlessly before him. His wealth, his achievements, they all felt hollow without meaningful connections. He thought of Emily, his sister, whom he hadn't spoken to in months. She had tried to reach him after their mother's death, offering support and seeking it in return, but he had shut her out. His focus had been on building his empire, not mending his family. Taking a deep breath, Mark picked up his phone and dialed her number. It rang twice before she answered, her voice cautious. "Mark, is everything okay?" "No," he admitted, his voice breaking slightly. "Emily, I've been terrible to you. I know I've let you down and I don't expect forgiveness, but I want to fix things. I want us to be close again." There was a pause and then her voice softened. "I've waited years to hear you say that. Let's start over, Mark." As he ended the call, a weight lifted from his chest. For the first time in years, Mark felt like he was rediscovering a part of himself, one that his mother had always believed in. Liam's call came late one evening, his voice sharp with urgency. "I've got something," he said. "Meet me at my office. Now." Mark wasted no time, grabbing his coat and heading into the night. The streets were quiet as his car sped through the city, his mind racing. Whatever Liam had uncovered, Mark knew it would change everything. When he arrived, Liam was waiting with a file spread across his cluttered desk. He gestured for Mark to sit. "The guy in the photo," Liam began, tapping on a grainy image clipped to the folder. "His name's Vincent Carver. Small-time fixer, specializes in cleaning up problems for powerful people. He's got a history. And guess who his biggest client has been for the past decade?" Mark's throat tightened. "Charles." "Bingo," Liam said, leaning back in his chair. "Gets worse. I found financial records linking Carver to a slush fund Charles has been managing off the books. The same fund your mother flagged in her journal. I'm talking payouts, bribes, hush money, the works." Mark's hands curled into fists. "And my mother? Did Charles? Was he responsible for her death?" Liam hesitated. "There's no smoking gun, Mark. But here's the thing. Your mother requested a meeting with Charles a week before she died. According to her notes, she was going to confront him about the discrepancies she found in your company's finances. After that, she told no one about the meeting, not even you. The next thing we know, she's dead." The room fell silent. Mark's mind reeled as the pieces clicked into place. Charles had silenced her. He couldn't prove it yet, but he didn't need more to know he was right. The betrayal cut deep. This wasn't just about his mother. It was about the life he had built on trust that had been shattered. "What do I do?" Mark asked, his voice low and tight. "You've got options," Liam said. "We can take this to the authorities, but you'll need more solid evidence if you want a case. Or, you confront Charles directly. Put the pressure on him." Mark's jaw tightened. The image of his mother's face, her warning, and the betrayal burned into his memory. "I'm done waiting," he said. "Charles is going to face me. Now." Mark strode into the conference room where Charles and the senior leadership team were assembled. The usual hum of polite conversation died the moment he entered, his presence commanding the room. He wasn't here for a meeting. He was here for the truth. Charles glanced up from his notes, a practiced smile on his face. "Mark, didn't expect you to join us today. Everything all right?" Mark didn't respond. He placed the photograph and a copy of the financial records on the table in front of Charles, his movements deliberate. "Recognize these?" he asked, his voice cold. Charles's smile faltered as he glanced at the items. His eyes narrowed slightly, but he maintained his composure. "What's this about?" "You tell me," Mark replied, leaning forward. "That's you with Vincent Carver, the man who's been funneling dirty money through our accounts. My mother knew about this, didn't she? She confronted you." The room went silent. The other executives exchanged nervous glances, their discomfort palpable. Charles's jaw tightened. "Mark, this is absurd. You can't seriously think." "I know she was planning to expose you," Mark interrupted, his voice rising. "And I know she died right after. So tell me, Charles, how far did you go to cover your tracks?" Charles's expression hardened, and for a moment the mask slipped. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said quietly. "Be careful with your accusations." "Or what?" Mark shot back. "You'll take me out too. Like you took her." A tense pause hung in the air. Charles looked around the room, realizing the weight of the evidence and the eyes now fixed on him. Finally he stood, straightening his tie. "This conversation is over. I'll have my attorney contact you." As Charles walked toward the door, Mark called after him. "You'll regret this. I'll expose everything." Charles hesitated but didn't turn around. When he left, the tension in the room broke, replaced by murmurs among the leadership team. Mark turned to them. "We're cleaning house. Starting today." In the weeks that followed, Mark worked tirelessly to rebuild his company, rooting out corruption and restoring transparency. For the first time in years he felt a sense of purpose, not for profit but for integrity. It was what his mother would have wanted. Months had passed since Mark had confronted Charles, and the changes in his life were undeniable. The investigation into his mother's death had brought new clarity, though not every question had an answer. Liam had unearthed enough evidence to force Charles into early retirement. The former CFO had disappeared from the public eye, his reputation in ruins. Legal proceedings loomed on the horizon, but Mark knew the fight wasn't over. Still, the storm that had consumed him began to ease. His company had stabilized under new leadership, with a renewed focus on ethics and transparency. Mark had also made strides in his personal life, reconnecting with his sister, Emily, and spending more time with the people who mattered most. One crisp autumn afternoon, Mark found himself standing at his mother's grave. The cemetery was peaceful, the leaves a cascade of red and gold. He held a bouquet of her favorite flowers, sunflowers, and placed them gently at the base of the headstone. The words engraved on the stone felt different now. "Beloved Mother, forever in our hearts." They no longer brought him only pain but also a sense of gratitude. Her love had been his guiding light, even in her absence. Mark knelt, brushing a few stray leaves from the stone. "I'm sorry it took me so long, Mom," he said, his voice soft but steady. "You tried to warn me even back then. I wasn't ready to hear it. But I am now. I promise I'll honor your memory, not just with words but with actions." The wind stirred, rustling the leaves around him. For a brief moment, Mark felt an almost imperceptible warmth on his shoulder, as though a hand had rested there. He closed his eyes, letting the sensation fill him with peace. When he opened them, he smiled. He wasn't alone anymore, not in his grief nor in his life. His mother's strength and values lived on through him, shaping the man he was becoming. Mark stood and took a deep breath, his gaze sweeping across the serene landscape. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in years, he felt ready to face it. "Thank you," he whispered, turning to leave. "For everything." Mark sat in his office, the morning sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. His desk, once cluttered with contracts and stock reports, now held a different kind of paperwork, proposals for a new philanthropic initiative. He had named it the Margaret Emerson Foundation, honoring his mother's legacy of kindness and perseverance. The foundation's mission was clear: to support single parents and families in need, ensuring they had the opportunities his mother had fought so hard to give him. The phone on his desk buzzed, breaking his thoughts. It was Emily. He smiled as he answered. "Hey, don't forget dinner tonight," she said, her tone teasing but firm. "I'm not letting you cancel this time." Mark chuckled. "I wouldn't dream of it. I'll be there." Their bond had grown stronger in the wake of everything they'd faced together. They had worked through years of unspoken pain and found solace in each other's company. Emily had even become a key advisor to the foundation, helping him shape its goals. After ending the call, Mark leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting out the window. The city stretched before him, bustling with life. For years, he had viewed it as a battlefield, a place where success was earned through relentless effort and sacrifice. Now he saw it differently. It was a tapestry of stories, connections, and possibilities, something worth nurturing, not just conquering. His thoughts wandered to the past few months, the challenges he had faced, and the truths he had uncovered. Losing his mother had changed him once, but her reappearance, whether real or a manifestation of his grief, had transformed him in ways he hadn't thought possible. He had faced his deepest fears, confronted betrayal, and found a renewed sense of purpose. A knock on the door brought him back to the present. His assistant entered, holding a folder. "Mr. Emerson, the team is ready for the presentation." Mark nodded and stood, his steps lighter than they'd been in years. As he walked to the conference room, he carried not just the weight of his responsibilities, but also the strength of his mother's unwavering belief in him. The future felt brighter now, filled with hope and a deeper understanding of what truly mattered. And for the first time in years, Mark knew he wasn't alone on the journey. Mark's story reminds us that success, while fulfilling, can sometimes cloud what truly matters: our connections, our integrity, and the people we hold dear. His journey through grief, betrayal, and self-discovery invites us to consider the unresolved threads in our own lives. How often do we prioritize work or ambition over meaningful relationships? If given the chance, what would you say to someone you've lost? Would you ask for forgiveness, express gratitude, or simply share a moment of connection? Take a moment to reflect on your own relationships. Are there loved ones you've drifted apart from, or words left unsaid? Let Mark's story serve as a gentle nudge to reach out, mend bridges, and honor the bonds that make life truly rich. Remember, love and memory transcend time, and it's never too late to make things right. We'd love to hear your thoughts about Mark's journey. Have you experienced a moment that made you reevaluate your priorities or reconnect with someone important in your life? Share your story in the comments below. Your insights could inspire someone else to take that first step toward healing or connection. If this story moved you, consider sharing it with others who might need a reminder about the importance of family, forgiveness, or personal transformation. And don't forget to subscribe for more heartfelt and thought-provoking tales like this one. Your feedback matters to us. Tell us what resonated most with you in this story, or what themes you'd like to see explored in future narratives. Together, we can continue to create stories that spark reflection and conversation. Stay tuned for our next story: The Letter That Arrived 30 Years Too Late. In this upcoming tale, a retired schoolteacher receives a mysterious letter in the mail, one that unravels a decades-old mystery and changes the course of her twilight years. It's a story about second chances, forgotten promises, and the unexpected ways life connects us all. Make sure to hit the notification bell so you don't miss it. If you enjoyed Mark's story, you won't want to miss this one. It's bound to tug at your heartstrings and leave you thinking about the power of time and forgiveness. Thank you for being part of our community, and we'll see you in the next story.